On a bitter February morning in Pine Creek, Montana, 78-year-old Mabel Sutton dragged a canvas sack of split logs down the frozen gravel road, her weathered hands trembling with each step. The wood was heavier than her frail frame could bear, but she pressed forward, tears streaming down her cheeks in the bitter wind. Recently laid-off carpenter Logan Hale pulled his rusty pickup over, his 8-year-old daughter Emma watching from the passenger seat as he approached the struggling woman. What he discovered in that bundle of wood would change everything, each log carved with love letters from a courtship 50 years past, now destined for the fire as her husband's homestead faced demolition. In a town where neighbors barely spoke anymore, one man's simple act of kindness would uncover a love story that had been hiding in plain sight. But could Logan save more than just an old woman's memories? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Logan Hale had learned to recognize the sound of desperation. It came in the form of labored breathing, the scrape of something too heavy being dragged across unforgiving ground, and the quiet sobs that people thought no one could hear. As he stepped out of his weathered Ford pickup, the February wind cut through his worn flannel shirt. But what stopped him cold wasn't the bitter Montana air, it was the sight of Mabel Sutton collapsing to her knees beside that canvas sack, her shoulders shaking with exhaustion. "Ma'am, you all right?" Logan approached slowly, his work boots crunching on the frozen gravel of County Road 47. Behind him, Emma pressed her face against the truck's fogged window, her breath creating small clouds as she watched her father do what he always did: help someone who needed it, even when they could barely help themselves. Mabel looked up with eyes that held a lifetime of Montana winters. Her gray hair had escaped its careful bun, and her cheeks were raw from the wind and tears. "I'm fine," she whispered, the words coming out more like a prayer than a statement. "Just resting a moment." Logan knelt beside her, his carpenter's hands gentle as he touched her shoulder. "That sack's got to weigh more than you do. What's got you hauling it down this road in weather like this?" "Wood," Mabel said simply, as if that explained everything. "Just wood for the fire." But Logan had spent 34 years working with wood, and he knew the difference between ordinary lumber and something precious. When he loosened the rope around the canvas sack, what he found inside made his breath catch. Each piece of split oak had been carved with meticulous care words flowing across the grain like poetry written in timber. "My dearest Mabel," he read aloud from the first piece, his voice soft with wonder. "Today I watched you hang laundry in the morning sun, and I knew that every sunrise for the rest of my life should begin with your smile." Mabel's tears came fresh then, and Logan understood that this wasn't just firewood. This was a love letter collection that someone had spent years creating, carved into the very bones of trees that had probably grown on this land for decades. "Harold," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My Harold wrote those. Every piece. He said wood would last longer than paper, that his words would keep me warm even after he couldn't." Logan felt something shift inside his chest, that familiar ache he'd carried since Sarah died 5 years ago. He knew what it meant to lose the person who made your world make sense. He also knew what it meant to try to preserve the pieces of them that remained. "He was right about the wood lasting," Logan said carefully. "But ma'am, forgive me for asking, why are you carrying them down this road instead of keeping them safe at home?" Mabel's laugh was bitter and broken. "Because home won't be home much longer." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper that had been handled so many times the creases were white with wear. 30 days. That's what they gave me. 30 days to find $12,000 in back taxes, or they take the homestead. Logan took the foreclosure notice with hands that had built houses, repaired barns, and crafted furniture that would outlast most of the people who owned it. He understood the weight of losing a home, not just the building, but the memories that lived in every board and beam. "The land's been in Harold's family for 87 years, Mabel continued. "We raised our children there, lost our children there. Harold's buried in the family plot behind the old oak tree, and now they want to tear it all down to build some fancy development. Logan studied the document, his jaw tightening as he read the details. $12,000. For most people, it might as well have been 12 million. For a carpenter who'd been laid off 3 weeks ago when the construction company folded, it was an impossible mountain. "So you're planning to burn the logs?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "One piece at a time, all winter long," Mabel said. "Harold's last gift to me. At least his words will keep me warm while I figure out where an old woman like me is supposed to go." Logan looked back at his truck, where Emma was now drawing hearts in the condensation on the window. His daughter had never known her mother, but she'd learned about love from watching her father struggle to keep Sarah's memory alive while building a new life for both of them. Emma understood that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. "Ma'am," Logan said, his voice carrying the quiet determination that had gotten him through 5 years of single parenthood. "I don't think Harold intended for you to burn these logs. I think he meant for them to be part of something bigger." Mabel looked at him with the wariness of someone who'd heard too many empty promises. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe there's another way to save your home. Maybe there's a way to honor Harold's memory and keep his words alive without turning them into ash." Logan helped Mabel to her feet, then hefted the canvas sack into his truck bed. The weight of it surprised him, not just the physical weight, but the emotional heft of carrying someone else's love story. As he drove Mabel back to the homestead, Emma chattering from the back seat about the pretty words on the wood, Logan found himself thinking about the last 5 years. After Sarah died, he'd focused on survival. Keep Emma fed, clothed, and safe. Keep the bills paid and the roof over their heads. Keep moving forward because stopping meant drowning in grief. But somewhere in that survival, he'd forgotten about living for something bigger than just getting through each day. The homestead sat on a rise overlooking Pine Creek Valley, its white farmhouse weathered but solid, surrounded by ancient oaks that had witnessed decades of Montana history. Logan could see why Harold's family had chosen this spot. It commanded a view of the entire valley, with the creek meandering through fields that would be green again come spring. "Harold used to say this land had good bones," Mabel said as they pulled up the gravel drive. "Said it was the kind of place that could hold a family's dreams for generations." Logan studied the property with a carpenter's eye, seeing past the peeling paint and sagging porch to the solid foundation beneath. The bones were indeed good. This was a house that could be restored, land that could be preserved, if someone had the will and the way. Inside, the farmhouse told the story of a life well lived. Photographs covered the mantel and walls, Harold and Mabel on their wedding day, children playing in the yard, grandchildren who'd grown up and moved away. In the kitchen, a faded wedding photo showed a young couple standing beneath the very oak tree that now shaded the family cemetery. 53 years we had, Mabel said, noticing Logan's gaze. Not nearly enough, but more than some people get. Logan thought about Sarah, about the 8 years they'd shared before cancer took her. Mabel was right, some people got more time than others, but what mattered was what you did with the time you had. As Emma explored the house with the fearless curiosity of childhood, Logan found himself drawn to the kitchen window that overlooked the valley. This was the view Harold had seen every morning, the landscape that had inspired him to carve love letters into wood. It was easy to understand why he'd wanted to preserve this place, to ensure that his words and his love would remain rooted in this soil. "Ma'am," Logan said, turning back to Mabel, "I know we just met, and I know I'm probably the last person who should be making promises about saving anyone's home. But I've been looking for a reason to use my hands for something that matters. If you'll let me, I'd like to help you find a way to keep this place." Mabel studied him for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "You don't even know me, Mr. Hale. Why would you want to get involved in an old woman's troubles?" Logan looked out the window again, watching Emma build a snowman in the yard where Harold and Mabel's children had once played. "Because some stories are too important to let end," he said simply. "And because I think Harold's love letters deserve to be read, not burned." Outside, the Montana wind carried the promise of more snow, But inside the farmhouse, something warmer began to grow. It was the beginning of hope, fragile as a seedling, but persistent as the oaks that had weathered nearly a century of storms. Logan didn't know how they would find $12,000. He didn't know how to fight City Hall or save a family homestead. But he knew how to work with wood, how to honor the craftsmanship of those who came before, and how to recognize when something was worth preserving. As the afternoon light faded over Pine Creek Valley, Logan made a decision that would change everything. He would not let Harold's love letters become ash. He would not let Mabel lose the only home she'd ever known. Somehow, some way, he would find a path forward that honored both the past and the future. The carved logs in his truck bed seemed to pulse with their own quiet energy, each word a testament to love that had survived decades and now needed to survive one more winter. Logan had never been a man given to grand gestures or impossible dreams, but as he looked at the homestead bathed in golden light, he understood that sometimes the most important battles were the ones that seemed impossible to win. Emma ran in from the yard, her cheeks red with cold and excitement. "Dad, Mrs. Mabel says there's a cemetery with angels in the backyard. Can we go see?" Logan looked at Mabel, who nodded with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all day. "Harold carved those angels himself," she said. "One for each of our babies we lost, and one for the children we raised. He said everyone deserves to be remembered." As they walked through the gathering dusk toward the family cemetery, Logan felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about saving a house or preventing a foreclosure. This was about preserving a legacy, protecting a love story, and ensuring that the people who had poured their hearts into this land would not be forgotten. The fight ahead would be difficult, but Logan had learned something important from his years of single parenthood. Sometimes the most worthwhile battles were the ones that seemed impossible to win. And sometimes the best way to honor your own losses was to prevent someone else from losing everything that mattered to them. The foreclosure notice felt heavier in Logan's hands the second time he read it. He sat at Mabel's kitchen table 3 days after their first meeting, Emma coloring at his side while Mabel prepared coffee with the careful ritual of someone who'd been making the same pot in the same kitchen for 5 decades. 27 days now, Mabel said, setting down 3 mismatched cups that told their own story of a household that had welcomed countless guests over the years. "I called the county office yesterday. They said the date is firm, March 15th, 9 in the morning. They'll post the auction notice next week." Logan studied the legal language, his carpenter's mind trying to pass the bureaucratic maze that stood between Mabel and her home. The document was dense with clauses and conditions, but the core message was brutally simple: pay $12,000 in back taxes and penalties, or lose everything. "How did it get this bad?" he asked gently, not wanting to sound accusatory, but needing to understand the full scope of what they were facing. Mabel's hands trembled slightly as she added sugar to her coffee. "Harold handled all the finances. For 53 years, he paid every bill on time, never missed a payment on anything. But toward the end, when the cancer got bad, things started slipping." Her voice carried the weight of guilt that Logan recognized the burden of feeling responsible for circumstances beyond anyone's control. "The medical bills came first," she continued. "Insurance covered some of it, but not the experimental treatments, not the trips to specialists in Denver and Seattle. Harold kept saying the land would provide, that we could take out a loan against the property if we needed to." Logan felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He'd walked a similar path with Sarah, watching helplessly as medical expenses devoured their savings and forced impossible choices between hope and financial stability. "After Harold died, I found a box in his desk," Mabel said, her voice growing quieter. "Unopened tax notices going back 3 years. Bills from the county that he'd hidden because he didn't want me to worry. He thought he'd beat the cancer, thought he'd have time to set things right." Emma looked up from her coloring, her 8-year-old intuition sensing the sadness in Mabel's voice. "My mom got sick too," she said matter-of-factly. "Daddy says sometimes people hide things because they love you, but it doesn't mean they love you less." Mabel's eyes filled with tears, but she managed to smile for Emma. "Your daddy is a wise man." Logan reached across the table and covered Mabel's weathered hand with his own. "You're not responsible for Harold's choices. He was protecting you the only way he knew how. But now I am responsible," Mabel said firmly. "And I don't have $12,000. I don't have $1,200. Harold's pension died with him, and Social Security barely covers the utilities and groceries." Logan pulled out his phone and opened the calculator app, though he already knew the math would be discouraging. "What about selling some of the land? The notice mentions 87 acres. Could you subdivide and sell a portion to cover the taxes?" Mabel shook her head. "The county won't allow it. Something about zoning restrictions and the property being designated as agricultural land. They said I'd have to pay for a survey, environmental studies, legal fees probably cost more than the taxes themselves, and there's no guarantee they'd approve it anyway. What about family, children, grandchildren who might be able to help?" The silence that followed was answer enough, but Mabel elaborated anyway. "Our son David died in Iraq 15 years ago. Our daughter Susan lives in California with her family. She's got 2 kids in college and a husband who was laid off last year. I called her when I first got the notice, but she's struggling too." Logan felt the walls closing in, each avenue of hope leading to another dead end. He'd faced similar moments during Sarah's illness, when every treatment option had been exhausted and reality demanded acceptance of the unacceptable. "There has to be something," he said, more to himself than to Mabel. "Some program for seniors, some way to appeal the decision." "I tried," Mabel said softly, "called every number on the notice, spoke to 3 different departments. They were polite but clear. The law is the law. Pay the taxes or lose the property." Emma finished coloring her pictura house surrounded by trees and flowers, with stick figures holding hands in the yard. She slid it across the table to Mabel. "This is your house with all the people who love you protecting it." Mabel studied the drawing with the reverence it deserved, then carefully placed it on the refrigerator beside faded school photos and grandchildren's artwork that had yellowed with age. "Thank you, sweetheart. It's the most beautiful thing I've seen in a long time." Logan walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the valley, where late afternoon shadows stretched across snow-covered fields. The homestead sat like an island of memory in a sea of change, surrounded by new developments that had sprouted over the past decade as Pine Creek evolved from ranching community to bedroom suburb. "What happens if you lose the property?" he asked. "Where would you go?" "There's a senior community in Billings," Mabel said. "1-room, shared bathroom down the hall. They said they might have an opening in the summer." She spoke without emotion, as if discussing someone else's life rather than her own future. Logan felt something ignite inside him, not just sympathy, but genuine anger at a system that could reduce a lifetime of love and labor to a legal notice and an auction block. This was more than financial hardship. This was the systematic erasure of history, the casual destruction of roots that had grown deep over nearly a century. "What about the carved logs?" Emma asked. "If the mean people take the house, what happens to Harold's love letters?" Mabel's composure finally cracked. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with the grief she'd been holding back. "I suppose they'll burn them all," she whispered. "Clear the land for whatever they plan to build." Logan made a decision that surprised even him. He'd spent 5 years playing it safe, making careful choices, avoiding risks that might jeopardize Emma's security. But watching Mabel's heart break, he realized that some risks were worth taking, not despite the potential consequences, but because of them. "No," he said firmly, "that's not going to happen." Mabel looked up, her eyes red but hopeful. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're going to fight this. I don't know how yet, but we're going to find a way to save your home." "Logan, you're a kind man, but you don't understand what we're up against. I've exhausted every option." "You've exhausted every conventional option," Logan corrected. "But sometimes conventional thinking isn't enough. Sometimes you have to get creative." He pulled out his phone and started making notes. "First, We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. I want to see every piece of paperwork, every notice, every communication you've had with the county. Then we need to research the property's history, find out if there are any historical designations or environmental protections that might apply. And if there aren't, Mabel asked. Logan met her gaze with the same determination he'd shown when Emma was born prematurely and the doctors weren't sure she'd survive. Then we make our own protection. We find people who care about preserving what matters, and we make enough noise that someone with power has to listen. Emma clapped her hands. Like a superhero team. Exactly like a superhero team, Logan agreed, ruffling his daughter's hair. Sometimes the best way to fight the impossible is to refuse to accept that it's impossible. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting the farmhouse in golden light, Logan felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival. He was no longer just trying to get through each day, he was fighting for something that mattered, something bigger than his own struggles. The foreclosure notice lay on the table between them, its stark language, a challenge that Logan was finally ready to accept. 27 days wasn't much time, but it was enough to begin. Enough to hope. Enough to prove that some love stories were too important to end with an auction gavel and a bulldozer. Outside, the carved logs waited in his truck bed, each word a testament to the power of persistence. Harold had spent years creating his love letters in wood, believing they would outlast paper and ink. Now it was Logan's turn to prove that some things were strong enough to outlast bureaucracy and greed. Harold's woodworking tools lay arranged on the workbench, as if their owner had stepped away for lunch and might return any moment. Logan ran his fingers along the smooth handles of chisels that had been sharpened and resharpened, so many times they'd taken on the shape of their user's grip. Each tool told a story of patient craftsmanship, of hands that understood wood as a living thing deserving of respect. He spent every morning out here for 40 years. Mabel said from the doorway of the barn that Harold had converted into his workshop. Coffee at sunrise, then 3 hours with his projects before starting the ranch work. He said working with wood cleared his mind for the day ahead. Logan lifted a handplane that felt perfectly balanced in his palm. The blade was still sharp enough to shave curls from a piece of pine, despite being untouched for over a year. He took care of his tools. Harold said a man's tools were an extension of his hands, and his hands were an extension of his heart. Mabel stepped into the workshop, her eyes taking in the half-finished projects that remained frozen in time. He was working on a cradle when he got sick. Said our granddaughter in California was expecting, and every baby deserved something made with love. Emma discovered a wooden toy box filled with carved animals, horses, cattle, dogs, and cats that moved on hidden hinges and wheels. Look, Dad, they're like the animals from the farm. Logan examined the toys with professional admiration. Each piece showed Harold's evolution as a craftsman, from simple cuts to intricate joinery that would challenge even experienced woodworkers. But more than technical skill, they revealed something deeper, a man who understood that his work would outlive him and wanted every piece to carry meaning. These aren't just toys, Logan said. They're heirlooms, museum, quality work. Harold always said the best compliment he could receive was watching a child play with something he'd made, Mabel replied. He carved those for David and Susan when they were little. Later he made sets for the grandchildren. Logan opened a cabinet beneath the workbench and found Harold's project journal's leather-bound books filled with sketches, measurements, and notes spanning decades. The pages revealed the mind of a man who approached each piece with the care of an architect and the soul of a poet. One sketch caught Logan's attention, a detailed plan for a community pavilion surrounded by gardens and walking paths. Harold's handwriting filled the margins with notes about native plants, bench placement, and sightlines that would showcase the valley's natural beauty. Mabel, look at this. Logan showed her the drawing. Did Harold ever mention wanting to build something like this? She studied the sketch, her expression growing thoughtful. He talked about it sometimes, especially after David died. Said the land was too beautiful to keep to ourselves, that maybe someday it could be a place where families could come together. He called it his someday project. Logan flipped through more pages, finding refinements to the pavilion design, botanical studies of native wildflowers, and even a rough budget for materials. Harold had been serious about this vision, serious enough to spend years developing plans that might never see daylight. When did he draw these? The last few years, mostly, after he retired from ranching and had more time for dreaming. Mabel's voice carried a note of regret. I encouraged him, told him it was a beautiful idea, but I never thought he'd actually pursue it. We were in our 70s, seemed like something for younger people to worry about. Emma had discovered a collection of carved wooden letters scattered across another workbench. She began arranging them into words, her face scrunched in concentration. Dad, what does this spell? Logan looked at the letters she'd assembled. C-O-M-U-N-I-T-Y. Community, he read aloud. Harold was making a sign, Mabel said softly. He said every special place needed a name. Logan felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to align in his mind. Harold hadn't just been a craftsman, he'd been a visionary who understood that land could serve purposes beyond individual ownership. The pavilion plans weren't just drawings, they were a blueprint for transformation. How much of the property would this community space have covered? Logan asked, studying the detailed site plan. About 5 acres, including the house and immediate grounds. Harold thought people should be able to walk through gardens to reach the pavilion, maybe have picnics where he used to graze cattle. Logan's carpenter mind began calculating. 5 acres of community space, with the farmhouse serving as a visitor center or caretaker's residence. It was exactly the kind of project that might qualify for historical preservation grants or community development funding if someone knew how to navigate those systems. Mabel, I need to ask you something important. If there was a way to save the property and honor Harold's vision at the same time, would you be open to sharing the land, making it a public space like he imagined? She looked around the workshop, taking in the tools and projects that represented a lifetime of patient creation. Harold always said the best way to honor someone's memory was to finish what they started. If his community pavilion could save our home, I think he'd be pleased. Emma held up another carved piece of wooden heart, with "Love Grows Here" etched in Harold's careful script. This one's pretty, Mrs. Mabel. What's it for? That was going to be part of the entrance gate, Mabel explained. Harold said people needed to know they were entering a place where love was the most important thing. Logan photographed the pavilion plans with his phone, already envisioning how they might be adapted to meet modern accessibility standards while preserving Harold's original vision. The design was ambitious but achievable, the kind of project that could attract community support if presented properly. I want to show these to someone, he said. My brother Marcus works in real estate development. He might know about funding sources for community projects. Mabel's expression grew wary. Your brother wouldn't be the same Marcus Hale who's been calling me about selling the property? Logan felt his stomach drop. Marcus has been calling you? 3 times in the past month. Very polite, very professional. Said he had clients interested in purchasing the land for development, might be able to offer more than the tax debt if I was motivated to sell. The familiar tension Logan felt whenever Marcus was involved began building in his chest. His brother had always been good at finding opportunities in other people's misfortunes, but this felt particularly calculating, circling Mabel's property, like a vulture waiting for the inevitable. I didn't know he was contacting you, Logan said honestly. We don't talk much anymore. He's your brother, Mabel said gently. Blood matters, especially when times get hard. Logan thought about the years since Sarah's death, how Marcus had offered financial help that came with strings attached, how every conversation felt like a business negotiation rather than family support. They'd grown up in the same house but developed completely different values about what constituted success. Sometimes blood isn't enough, Logan replied. But your right family matters. And right now, you and Emma are more family to me than Marcus has been in years. Emma had moved on to exploring a collection of wood samples, each piece labeled with tree species and harvest dates going back decades. Dad, look, Harold saved pieces from every tree he ever cut down. Logan examined the sample soak, pine, cedar, mapleach piece, carefully preserved with notes about the tree's location and the projects it had become. Harold had been a steward of the land, someone who understood that every tree cut was a responsibility to create something worthy of the sacrifice. As the afternoon light faded through the workshop windows, Logan felt a growing sense of urgency. 24 days remained before the foreclosure auction, and Marcus's involvement suggested that interested buyers were already positioning themselves to acquire the property. The community pavilion plans might be Harold's gift to saving Mabel's home, but only if Logan could move quickly enough to outmaneuver his brother's business interests. "Mabel," he said, carefully rolling up the pavilion drawings, "I need you to trust me on something. Don't accept any offers to sell, don't sign any papers, and don't take any more calls from Marcus until we've had a chance to explore other options." She nodded slowly. "What do you have in mind?" "I'm going to find out if Harold's vision can become Harold's legacy. And if it can, we're going to build something that honors both his memory and your right to call this place home." Emma's hand-drawn map covered most of Mabel's kitchen table, its colored pencil boundaries marking everything from Harold's Angel Cemetery to the place where love letters grow on trees. She'd spent the morning exploring the property with the fearless curiosity of childhood, creating a document that captured details no surveyor would ever notice. "This is where I found the baby deer tracks," Emma explained, pointing to a purple X near the creek. "And this is where Mrs. Mabel said Harold used to sit every morning to watch the sunrise." Logan studied his daughter's interpretation of the homestead, impressed by her instinct for mapping relationships rather than just geography. Emma had drawn the house as the heart of the property, with paths radiating outward like arteries carrying life to every corner of the land. "She's got an eye for design," Mabel said, serving Emma hot chocolate topped with marshmallows. Harold would have loved showing her all his secret places. Logan's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Need to talk. Heard you're meddling in my business deal. Coffee at Murphy's, 2 p.m. The message carried the imperious tone that had characterized their relationship since childhood. Marcus issuing commands, Logan expected to comply. But this wasn't about sibling rivalry anymore. This was about protecting Mabel's home and honoring a dead man's dreams. "I need to step out for a bit," Logan told Mabel. "Can Emma stay here while I handle some business?" "Of course, we were planning to bake cookies for the church potluck anyway." Mabel smiled at Emma, who was already eyeing the cookie jar shaped like a pig that sat beside the stove. Murphy's Diner occupied the same corner it had for 60 years, its red vinyl booths and black and white checkered floor, unchanged despite 3 different owners. Marcus sat in their usual booth, his expensive suit incongruous among the ranchers and retirees who made up the afternoon crowd. "You look like hell," Marcus said by way of greeting, not bothering to stand as Logan approached. "Nice to see you too." Logan slid into the booth, noting how his brother's appearance had continued to evolve toward polished, corporate, success-perfect haircut, manicured nails, shoes that probably cost more than Logan's monthly grocery budget. "I hear you've been playing White Knight with the old lady on County Road 47, Marcus continued, stirring sugar into his coffee with practiced precision. "Noble gesture, but you're interfering with a legitimate business opportunity. Since when is buying someone's distressed property a legitimate business opportunity?" Marcus's smile held no warmth. "Since the free market became the engine of American prosperity, Mrs. Sutton has a problem. She owes money she doesn't have. I have clients with a solution. They'll pay her debt, plus a premium for the land. Everyone wins. Everyone except Mabel, who loses the only home she's ever known. Logan, you can't save everyone. Hell, you can barely save yourself." Marcus gestured toward Logan's worn flannel shirt and scuffed boots. "When's the last time you had steady work? When's the last time Emma got new clothes instead of hand-me-downs from whatever charity Sarah's sister drops off?" The mention of Sarah hit like a physical blow, but Logan kept his expression neutral. Marcus had always known exactly where to aim his verbal punches for maximum damage. "This isn't about me," Logan said quietly. "It's about doing the right thing." "The right thing?" Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and brittle. "The right thing is recognizing reality. Mrs. Sutton is 80 years old, living alone on property she can't maintain. She needs to be in assisted living, not rattling around that old farmhouse pretending she's still capable of independent living. Have you spent any time with her? Actually talked to her instead of just calculating the profit margin on her misery?" Marcus's expression hardened. "I've spent time reading financial statements and property assessments. The woman is drowning in debt, and that land is worth 4 times what she owes in taxes. My clients are offering her a life preserver, not a millstone." Logan thought about Emma's map, about Harold's community pavilion plans, about the carved logs that told a love story spanning half a century. There were kinds of value that couldn't be measured in dollars per acre. "What if there was another way?" Logan asked. "What if the property could be preserved and Mabel could stay?" "Like what? You going to wave your magic hammer and conjure $12,000 out of sawdust?" "Like converting it to a community park. Historical preservation. Harold had plans for a pavilion and garden sit. Could be exactly the kind of project that attracts grant funding." Marcus's laugh was genuinely amused this time. "You want to turn her land into a park? Logan, do you have any idea how complex those projects are? Environmental impact studies, zoning approvals, community input meetings, construction permits we're talking years of bureaucracy and hundreds of thousands of dollars in development costs. So you think it's impossible? I think it's a fantasy, and while you're chasing fantasies, my clients are offering real money for real solutions." Logan studied his brother's face, seeing the calculation behind his dismissal. Marcus wasn't just protecting a business deal, he was protecting his worldview, one that reduced every human situation to profit and loss columns. "What happens to the property if your clients buy it?" "Subdivision. 15 to 20 lots for executive homes. Prime location, valley views, easy commute to Billings. It's exactly what Pine Creek needs: economic development, increased tax base, quality housing for professional families." "And Harold's legacy? The land his family farmed for 87 years? Marcus shrugged. "Nostalgia doesn't pay property taxes. Progress requires leaving the past behind." Logan felt the fundamental divide between them, crystallizing into something unbridgeable. Marcus saw land as commodity, relationships as transactions, human stories as obstacles to efficiency. Logan saw connections that transcended financial calculation, value that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. "I'm going to fight this," Logan said simply. "With what army? You're unemployed, Logan. You've got no money, no political connections, no experience with municipal bureaucracy. You're Don Quixote tilting at windmills." "Maybe, but at least I'm fighting for something that matters." Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to the tone he'd used as a child when threatening to tell their parents about Logan's transgressions. "Stay out of this. I'm trying to help Mrs. Sutton, whether she realizes it or not. Don't let your savior complex ruin a good thing for everyone involved." Logan stood, dropping a $5 bill on the table to cover coffee he hadn't touched. "Some things are more important than good business, Marcus. If you ever figure that out, maybe we can have a real conversation." As he walked toward the door, Marcus called after him, "You've got 18 days, Logan. 18 days to perform a miracle. When your fantasy falls apart, don't blame me for dealing with reality." Outside, the February air felt clean after the toxic atmosphere of the diner. Logan sat in his truck for a moment, trying to process the conversation and its implications. Marcus wasn't just a business rival anymore. He was actively working against everything Logan was trying to accomplish. But Emma's map lay on the passenger seat, its innocent optimism, a reminder that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the odds. Harold had spent years planning his community pavilion, believing that love and vision could transform ordinary land into something extraordinary. Logan started the truck and headed back toward the homestead, where Emma and Mabel were probably pulling cookies from the oven and planning their next adventure. He might not have Marcus's resources or connections, but he had something his brother had lost somewhere along the way, the ability to see value in things that couldn't be bought or sold. 18 days to perform a miracle. Logan had faced longer odds with higher stakes, and somehow Emma was still laughing in backyards, still believing that her father could fix whatever was broken in the world. Maybe that faith would be enough. Maybe Harold's vision and Mabel's determination and Emma's innocent hope could overcome Marcus's cold calculation. Maybe some stories were strong enough to survive in a world that measured everything by profit margins. The original property deed lay spread across the kitchen table like a treasure map to forgotten history. Logan traced the faded ink signatures with his finger, each name representing a transfer of dreams from one generation to the next. The document dated back to 1938, when Harold's grandfather had purchased 87 acres from the Montana Territory Land Office for the sum of $437. "I never really looked at it closely," Mabel said, adjusting her reading glasses to peer at the yellowed parchment. "Harold kept all the important papers in his filing cabinet. I only found this after the foreclosure notice came." Emma leaned across the table, studying the ornate script with the fascination children reserved for anything that looked ancient and mysterious. "It's like pirate treasure writing," she declared. "All fancy and old-timey." Logan smiled at his daughter's observation, but his attention was caught by something more significant, a notation in the deed's margin that referenced historical easement rights and mineral extraction limitations. The language was legal and dense, but it suggested restrictions on how the land could be developed. "Mabel, do you know anything about easement rights on the property?" She shook her head slowly. "Harold mentioned something once about mineral rights, said his grandfather was smart enough to keep those when he sold some acreage to the railroad back in the 50s. But I never understood the details." Logan photographed the deed with his phone, then called the county recorder's office. After 20 minutes of being transferred between departments, he finally reached someone who could access historical land records. "Yes, Mr. Hale, I show several notations on that property," the clerk said, her voice crackling through his phone's speaker. "There's a historical preservation easement filed in 1987 and mineral rights restrictions dating back to the original homestead grant. You'll need to come in to see the full file. Some of those documents are too fragile to photocopy." Logan felt his pulse quicken. Historical preservation easements were serious legal instruments, the kind of protection that could complicate any development plans Marcus's clients might have. If the property was already protected by historical designation, subdivision might be impossible regardless of who owned the land. "I'll be there this afternoon," Logan told the clerk. The drive to the county courthouse gave him time to think. If Harold's property had legitimate historical protection, it raised questions about why the foreclosure was proceeding without considering those restrictions. It also suggested that Marcus might not have done his homework as thoroughly as he claimed. The courthouse archives occupied a basement room that smelled of old paper and bureaucratic patience. Logan spread the property files across a research table, Emma beside him with a coloring book, while Mabel read through documents with the careful attention of someone whose life hung in the balance. The historical easement document was a revelation. Filed by Harold's father in 1987, it designated the homestead as a significant example of early Montana agricultural settlement and restricted any modifications that would substantially alter the historic character of the structures and landscape. "This is huge," Logan said, his voice echoing in the quiet archives. "This easement doesn't just protect the house, it covers the entire property. Any development would require approval from the State Historic Preservation Office." Mabel looked up from a file folder thick with mineral rights documentation. "Does that mean they can't foreclose?" "No, they can still foreclose for unpaid taxes. But it means whoever buys the property has to respect these restrictions. Marcus's clients might not be able to build their subdivision even if they acquire the land." Emma discovered a folder labeled cemetery registration, and pulled out a document that made Logan's breath catch. Harold's family cemetery had been officially registered with the state in 1952, with provisions protecting it in perpetuity, regardless of property ownership changes. "The cemetery is protected too," Logan said, reading through the registration. "Even if the property is sold, the new owners would be legally required to maintain access and preserve the burial sites." Mabel's eyes filled with tears. "Harold never told me about any of this. He just said his father was particular about keeping family things in the family." Logan gathered the documents, his mind racing with possibilities. These weren't just bureaucratic technicalities, they were legal shields that Harold's family had erected over decades to protect their legacy. The question was whether those shields would be enough to save Mabel's home. His phone rang as they prepared to leave the courthouse. The caller ID showed Pine Creek Elementary School. "Mr. Hale, this is Principal Davidson. Emma's teacher would like to speak with you about a project she's been working on. Could you stop by when you pick her up today?" Logan glanced at Emma, who was carefully folding one of her drawings to fit in her pocket. "Is everything all right?" "Oh yes, everything's fine. Mrs. Peterson just wanted to discuss Emma's presentation for the local history fair. Apparently she's been quite passionate about her research." At the school, Mrs. Peterson greeted them with the enthusiasm of a teacher who discovered a student's hidden talent. Emma's third-grade classroom was decorated with posters about Montana history, but her desk was covered with photographs, drawings, and handwritten notes that looked far more sophisticated than typical 8-year-old schoolwork. "Emma has been telling her classmates about Mrs. Sutton's homestead," Mrs. Peterson explained. "She's created quite an impressive research project about early settlement families in Pine Creek Valley." Emma beamed with pride as she showed them her presentation board. She'd mounted photographs of the farmhouse, Harold's carved logs, and the family cemetery, alongside a timeline of the Sutton family's presence in Montana. Her handwriting was careful and deliberate as she read her conclusion aloud. "The Sutton homestead is important because it shows how families built Montana with love and hard work. Harold carved love letters in wood because he knew love should last forever. If we let the homestead be destroyed, we're saying that love doesn't matter as much as money, and that's not true." Logan felt his throat tighten with emotion. His 8-year-old daughter had articulated the heart of their struggle with a clarity that cut through all the legal complexities and financial calculations. "Mrs. Peterson," Logan said carefully, "what exactly happens with these local history presentations?" "They're judged by the Pine Creek Historical Society next Friday. The winning projects are displayed at the town council meeting the following Monday. It's become quite a community tradition. The whole town usually attends to see what our students have discovered about local history." Logan felt pieces of a plan beginning to form. The town council meeting would be exactly the forum they needed to present Harold's community pavilion vision and challenge the foreclosure publicly. If Emma's presentation could educate the community about the homestead's historical significance, it might create the grassroots support they needed. Would it be possible for Emma to expand her presentation, maybe include information about historical preservation and community development? Mrs. Peterson's eyes lit up. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd ask. Emma's work deserves a larger audience, and her passion for the subject is quite remarkable." As they drove home through the gathering dusk, Logan felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in weeks. The historical easements provided legal protection, Emma's presentation could generate community support, and Harold's pavilion plans offered a positive vision for the property's future. But time remained their enemy. 12 days until the foreclosure auction, 7 days until the Historical Society judging, and somewhere in those narrow windows, they needed to orchestrate a miracle that would honor Harold's memory while saving Mabel's home. Emma fell asleep in the back seat, her presentation notes scattered across her lap, her faith in her father's ability to fix the world still intact. Logan drove carefully through the Montana darkness, carrying the weight of that trust and the growing conviction that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. Harold's unfinished community park plans emerged from their hiding place like a gift from the past. Logan carefully unrolled the blueprint that had been tucked inside the farmhouse's kitchen wall, its edges yellowed, but its vision crystal clear. The drawing showed pathways winding through native gardens, a central pavilion for gatherings, and benches positioned to capture the valley's most breathtaking views. He hid it behind the loose board by the window. Mabel said, her voice filled with wonder. I always wondered why that section of wall sounded hollow when I tapped it. Harold said he was saving it for the right time. Emma traced the pavilion's outline with her finger, her eyes bright with possibility. It looks like a fairy tale castle, but for regular people to visit. Logan studied the technical specifications Harold had included. Foundation requirements, material lists, estimated costs that had probably doubled in the decades since they were calculated. But the vision itself was timeless, a place where community could gather, where families could celebrate, where the land's beauty could be shared rather than subdivided. He worked on this for years, Mabel continued, pulling out additional sketches that showed seasonal plantings and maintenance schedules. Every evening after dinner, he'd sit at this table and refine the details, said someday we'd build it together, invite the whole valley to help. Logan photographed each page, already envisioning how Harold's plans could be adapted to meet modern accessibility standards and building codes. The pavilion design was ambitious but achievable, especially if the community could be rallied to support the project. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Margaret Chen from Pine Creek Historical Society. Heard about your research on the Sutton property. Would love to discuss. Can we meet tomorrow? Logan showed the message to Mabel, who nodded recognition. Margaret's lived here longer than anyone except me. If she's interested in Harold's story, that's a very good sign. They met Margaret the next morning at the Historical Society's office in the old railroad depot, a building that had been converted into a museum celebrating Pine Creek's agricultural heritage. Margaret was a woman in her 70s with silver hair and the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent decades preserving other people's stories. I've been following the situation with your property, Margaret told Mabel without preamble. The Historical Society has been concerned about the precedent it would set. If we can't protect properties with legitimate historical significance, what's to stop developers from dismantling our entire heritage district? Logan spread Harold's pavilion plans across the museum's research table. Mrs. Sutton's late husband had a vision for sharing the property with the community. We think it might be the key to saving the homestead. Margaret studied the drawings with the appreciation of someone who understood both historical significance and practical implementation. This is remarkable work. Harold had real insight into landscape design and community planning. The question is whether the vision is achievable, Logan said. We've got 9 days before the foreclosure auction, and we need to present a viable alternative to selling to developers. Margaret removed her reading glasses and looked directly at Mabel. What would you think about the Historical Society taking a formal position on preserving your property? We've never gotten involved in foreclosure cases before, but this situation seems to warrant an exception. Mabel's eyes filled with tears. You'd do that for us? We'd do it for Pine Creek's heritage. Your property represents 87 years of continuous family stewardship. Harold's community pavilion could serve as a model for other rural preservation projects across Montana. Logan felt hope building in his chest. Margaret's support carried real weight in the community. The Historical Society had successfully fought several development projects over the years, and their endorsement could sway public opinion. What would that support look like practically, he asked. First, we'd make a formal presentation to the town council, highlighting the property's historical significance. Second, we'd help you apply for emergency historical designation, which could delay the foreclosure while the application is reviewed. Third, we'd assist with grant applications for community development funding. Emma had been quietly exploring the museum's displays, but she returned to the table carrying a photograph that made everyone stop talking. The black and white image showed the Pine Creek Valley as it appeared in the 1940s rolling hills, dotted with farmsteads, families gathered for harvest celebrations, children playing in fields that now housed shopping centers. "Mrs. Margaret, is this the same place where Mrs. Mabel lives?" Margaret nodded. "That photograph was taken from the hill behind the Sutton homestead. Your property is the only working farm still visible in that original landscape, Mabel. Everything else has been developed or subdivided." Logan studied the photograph, understanding finally why Harold's pavilion plans were so important. The homestead wasn't just one family's legacy, it was the last intact piece of Pine Creek's agricultural heritage, the final connection to the community's founding identity. "We need to make people understand what they're about to lose," Logan said. "Not just Mabel's home, but the last link to their own history." Margaret reached for her phone. "I'm calling an emergency meeting of the Historical Society Board. If we're going to take action, we need to move quickly." As Margaret made arrangements, Logan found himself drawn to a display case containing artifacts from Pine Creek's early settlement period, hand tools, family photographs, deed documents that told the story of how Montana had been carved from wilderness by determination and hope. Emma pressed her face against the glass, studying a collection of carved wooden toys that looked remarkably similar to the ones Harold had made. "Dad, look. These are just like the animals in Harold's workshop." The placard identified the toys as examples of traditional folk art donated by the Sutton family, 1987. Harold had been contributing to the Historical Society's collection for decades, preserving the craftsmanship traditions that connected past to present. He was already sharing his work with the community, Logan realized aloud. The pavilion plans weren't just a dream, they were the next step in a lifetime of civic contribution. Mabel wiped her eyes with a tissue Margaret had provided. "Harold always said the best way to honor your ancestors was to make sure future generations had something worth inheriting." Margaret ended her phone call with obvious satisfaction. "The board will meet tomorrow evening. They want to hear Harold's story and see his pavilion plans. This could be exactly the catalyst we need." As they prepared to leave the museum, Emma tugged on Logan's sleeve. "Dad, I have an idea for my presentation. What if I told everyone about how Harold's toys are here in the museum, and how his pavilion could make more places for kids to learn about history?" Logan knelt to Emma's level, seeing the earnest determination in her eyes. "That's a brilliant connection, sweetheart. History isn't just about the past, it's about creating a future worth preserving." The drive back to the homestead felt different somehow, charged with possibility rather than weighed down by desperation. Harold's hidden plans had provided more than architectural blueprints. They'd given the community a reason to care about Mabel's fate beyond simple sympathy. 8 days remained before the foreclosure auction, but for the first time, Logan felt they were building something rather than just fighting against inevitable loss. The Historical Society's support, Emma's presentation, and Harold's vision were converging into a narrative that transcended individual hardship. As they pulled into the farmhouse driveway, Logan noticed a black sedan parked near the barn, the kind of car that suggested business rather than social visits. His optimism faded as he recognized the vehicle's occupant, Marcus, standing beside Harold's workshop with a briefcase in one hand and his phone pressed to his ear. The battle for Mabel's home was about to become a family conflict, with Logan's 8-year-old daughter caught in the middle of forces that would determine whether love letters carved in wood would survive to inspire future generations. The bank president's personal letter lay hidden beneath decades of routine correspondence, its contents so explosive that Logan had to read it twice before the implications sank in. He'd been searching through Harold's filing cabinet for financial records when the yellowed envelope slipped from between tax documents, its return address showing First National Bank of Pine Creek and a date from 37 years ago. Marcus stood in the doorway of Harold's study, his expression unreadable as he watched Logan piece together information that changed everything they thought they knew about the foreclosure. "You need to read this," Logan said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. The letter was addressed to Harold personally, written in the careful script of someone who understood the weight of permanent records. It was signed by William Henderson, the current bank president's father, and its contents revealed a vendetta that had been simmering for nearly 4 decades. March 15, 1988, Logan read aloud. Dear Mr. Sutton, your refusal to sell the mineral rights to my development partners has cost both of us a significant opportunity. I want you to understand that this decision will have consequences beyond what you might anticipate. The banking business is built on relationships, and severed relationships have a way of affecting future transactions. I suggest you reconsider your position while there's still time to repair the damage you've done. Respectfully yours, William Henderson Sr. Mabel sank into Harold's desk chair, her face pale with understanding. Harold never told me about this. He said the mineral rights deal fell through, but he never mentioned any threats. Marcus moved closer, studying the letter with the professional interest of someone who recognized legal liability when he saw it. This is a smoking gun. If the current bank president is pursuing this foreclosure based on his father's grudge, that's a clear conflict of interest. Logan felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. The foreclosure notice came from First National. Harold banked there for 50 years, never missed a payment until he got sick, and suddenly they're accelerating the timeline instead of working out a payment plan. Emma had been quietly exploring Harold's bookshelf, but she returned to the desk carrying a small wooden box that rattled with the sound of hidden contents. Dad, this was behind the big dictionary. It's locked, but maybe Mrs. Mabel has the key. Mabel recognized the box immediately. Harold's private papers. He said I'd know when it was time to open it. She retrieved a small key from her jewelry box upstairs and returned to find the entire family gathered around the desk in anticipation. Inside the wooden box lay a collection of documents that told the real story of the Sutton family's relationship with Pine Creek's banking establishment. More letters from William Henderson Sr., increasingly aggressive in tone, as Harold continued to refuse mineral rights deals that would have enriched both men. Legal opinions from a Billings attorney advising Harold about harassment and extortion. And most damning of all, a recorded conversation transcript from 1989. Harold recorded his phone calls, Logan said, reading the transcript header. This conversation is between Harold and Henderson Sr., dated 6 months after the original letter. Marcus took the transcript, his expression growing increasingly serious as he read. Henderson Sr. explicitly states that he'll make Harold's banking relationship as difficult as possible unless the mineral rights are transferred. That's extortion, plain and simple. Logan found another document that made his blood run colder. Detailed account of suspicious banking practices Harold had documented over the years. Loan applications delayed without explanation, legitimate checks held for excessive clearance periods, and mortgage refinancing requests that were denied, despite Harold's excellent payment history. They've been systematically harassing your family for 30 years, Logan told Mabel. This foreclosure isn't about unpaid taxes, it's about finishing what Henderson Sr. started. Emma discovered one more item in the wooden box, a small digital recorder that had been carefully wrapped in cloth. Dad, what's this? Logan examined the device, recognizing it as a voice recorder from the early 2000s. When he pressed play, Harold's voice filled the study with the careful cadence of a man documenting evidence for posterity. This is Harold Sutton, recording on March 15, 2005, exactly 17 years after William Henderson Sr. first threatened my family. I'm making this record because I believe his son, William Henderson Jr., is continuing his father's campaign to force us off our land. The foreclosure proceedings against the Morrison farm last year followed the same pattern-accelerated timeline, refused payment plans, mysterious complications that benefited Henderson's development partners. The recording continued for nearly an hour, detailing suspicious banking practices that suggested a systematic effort to acquire distressed properties throughout Pine Creek Valley. Harold had been investigating the bank's foreclosure patterns, documenting cases where families lost their land under circumstances that seemed designed to benefit specific developers. Marcus whistled low under his breath. If this is accurate, we're looking at a decades-long conspiracy to manipulate property acquisitions. The legal implications are staggering. Logan felt his anger crystallizing into something focused and dangerous. Your development clients, they wouldn't happen to be connected to First National Bank, would they? Marcus's silence was answer enough, but he eventually nodded. Henderson Jr. introduced them to me, said they were looking for quality agricultural properties with development potential. So you're part of this, Logan said, his voice deadly quiet. You've been helping them complete Harold's destruction. I didn't know about any of this, Marcus protested. I thought it was a legitimate business opportunity. Mrs. Sutton needed money, my clients needed land. It seemed like a mutually beneficial arrangement. Emma looked up from Harold's recording device, her 8-year-old face serious with understanding that went beyond her years. The bad people have been trying to steal Mrs. Mabel's house for my whole life. Mabel covered Emma's small hand with her own weathered fingers. Not steal, sweetheart, but they haven't been playing fair, and that's sometimes worse than stealing. Logan gathered all the documents, his carpenter's mind already building a strategy from the evidence Harold had so carefully preserved. This changes everything. We're not just fighting a foreclosure anymore, we're exposing corruption that goes back decades. Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts with obvious agitation. I need to call my clients and explain that the deal is off. If this comes out in court, anyone associated with Henderson could face criminal charges. Good, Logan said flatly. Let them find another family to exploit. The late afternoon sun slanted through Harold's study windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits, celebrating long-awaited justice. Harold had spent his final years documenting the campaign against his family, building a case that could protect not just Mabel, but other families who'd been targeted by the same systematic corruption. What do we do with all this? Mabel asked, gesturing toward the pile of evidence that represented her late husband's final gift to their community. Logan looked at his brother, seeing something that might have been shame flickering behind Marcus's polished facade. We take it to the FBI. Bank fraud, extortion, conspiracy, this is federal territory now. Emma clapped her hands with delight. Like on TV, the good guys are going to win. Maybe, Logan said carefully. But even if they do, we still need to save your home, Mrs. Mabel. Federal investigations take time we don't have. Marcus closed his briefcase and straightened his tie, the gestures of a man trying to salvage dignity from a collapsed situation. The Historical Society meeting is tomorrow night. If you present this evidence along with Harold's community pavilion plans, the town council would have to be insane to allow the foreclosure to proceed. Logan studied his brother's face, seeing something that might have been genuine regret. Why are you helping us now? Because Dad taught us that family matters more than money, Marcus said quietly. I forgot that lesson for a while, but Harold's letters remind me what happens when people choose profit over people. As the brothers worked together for the first time in years, organizing Harold's evidence into a coherent case against the bank's corruption, Emma continued exploring the study's hidden treasures. Her discovery of Harold's final recorded message would provide the emotional punctuation mark their case needed to transform legal documents into a story that could move hearts as well as minds. 6 days remained before the foreclosure auction, but Harold's posthumous revelation had shifted the battlefield entirely. They were no longer just trying to save one family's home, they were fighting to expose a conspiracy that had been devastating their community for decades. The carved logs in Logan's truck bed seemed to pulse with new significance, each love letter now representing not just Harold's devotion to Mabel, but his commitment to protecting future generations from the forces that had tried to destroy his legacy. Justice had been a long time coming to Pine Creek Valley, but Harold Sutton had made sure it would eventually arrive. The Pine Creek Community Center hadn't seen this much activity since the county fair 3 summers ago. Logan arrived an hour early to find Margaret Chen and her historical society volunteers already arranging displays, their efficiency suggesting decades of experience in presenting complex information to skeptical audiences. The town council moved the meeting to accommodate the expected crowd, Margaret explained, gesturing toward folding chairs that filled every available space. Word about Harold's evidence has spread faster than wildfire. Half the valley has questions about their own dealings with First National Bank. Logan helped arrange Harold's pavilion plans on easels that would allow the entire audience to see the vision that had been hidden in farmhouse walls for years. Each drawing told part of a larger story about community, preservation, and the kind of future Pine Creek could choose if it valued heritage over quick profit. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, putting finishing touches on her presentation poster with the focused determination of someone who understood the stakes. Her display board now included photographs of Harold's carved logs, copies of the historical documents they'd discovered, and her own hand-drawn interpretation of how the community pavilion could serve families for generations. "Dad, do you think people will understand why Harold's love letters are important?" she asked, her voice carrying the slight tremor of a child preparing for her first major public speaking appearance. Logan knelt beside his daughter, smoothing a wrinkled corner of her poster. "Sweetheart, when people see Harold's work and hear his story, they're going to understand exactly why love letters should last forever." Marcus entered the community center carrying boxes of photocopied evidence, his expensive suit replaced by jeans and a flannel shirt that made him look more like the brother Logan remembered from their childhood. The transformation wasn't just sartorial. Marcus moved with the purpose of someone who'd rediscovered what he was fighting for. "FBI field office in Billings confirmed they'll open an investigation," Marcus reported, setting down his boxes near the registration table. "Agent Rodriguez said Harold's documentation is the most comprehensive financial fraud case she's seen in 20 years. They're already pulling Henderson's banking records." Mabel arrived wearing her best dress navy blue with small flowers that Harold had picked out for their 50th wedding anniversary. She carried a shoebox filled with additional photographs and mementos that would help people understand the human cost of institutional greed. "How are you feeling about tonight?" Logan asked, noting the determined set of her shoulders despite the obvious nerves in her expression. "Like Harold's watching," she said simply. "He spent so many years gathering that evidence, waiting for the right time to use it. I think tonight is the time he was waiting for." The community center began filling with residents whose faces told the story of Pine Creek's evolution from agricultural community to suburban bedroom town. Longtime ranchers sat beside young professionals who'd moved to the valley for affordable housing and mountain views. The generational divide that often characterized small-town politics seemed less important tonight, united by shared concern about institutional corruption that had touched every family in some way. Logan recognized William Henderson Jr. the moment he entered the community center. The bank president carried himself with the confident bearing of someone who'd never questioned his right to shape other people's destinies, but his expression suggested he was beginning to understand that Harold Sutton's legacy might be more resilient than anticipated. "He looks nervous," Emma observed, watching Henderson take a seat in the back row, where he could observe without being easily seen. "Good," Logan replied. "He should be nervous." Margaret called the meeting to order with the authority of someone who'd been mediating community disputes since before Logan was born. The Historical Society's presentation began with Emma's school project, her young voice carrying clearly through the packed room as she explained why the Sutton homestead represented more than just one family's story. "Harold carved love letters in wood because he knew paper doesn't last," Emma read from her carefully prepared notes. "But love should last forever, and so should the places where love grows. The Sutton homestead is where love grew for 87 years, and if we let it be destroyed, we're saying that love doesn't matter as much as money." The audience listened with the respectful attention adults reserved for children who spoke truths that grown-ups had complicated beyond recognition. Emma's presentation photos passed from hand to hand, images of Harold's carved logs, the family cemetery, the farmhouse that had sheltered 3 generations of dreams and sorrows. Margaret followed Emma's presentation with a detailed explanation of the homestead's historical significance, using Harold's own documentation to trace the property's role in Pine Creek's agricultural development. The pavilion plans drew audible gasps from audience members who recognized Harold's vision as exactly what their growing community needed: a place where past and future could coexist. Logan's presentation of the banking corruption evidence created a different kind of reaction. The room fell silent as he read excerpts from William Henderson Sr.'s threatening letters, the recorded phone conversations where Harold had documented systematic harassment, and the pattern of suspicious foreclosures that had benefited the same development partners for nearly 4 decades. "This isn't just about Mrs. Sutton's home," Logan concluded, his voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who'd spent weeks uncovering institutional betrayal. "This is about whether Pine Creek will be a community that protects its families or a marketplace where everything is for sale to the highest bidder." Henderson Jr. stood from his back row seat, his face flushed with embarrassment and indignation. "These are serious accusations against my family's reputation and my bank's integrity. I demand the right to respond." Margaret nodded with judicial fairness. "The floor is yours, Mr. Henderson." Henderson's defense crumbled under the weight of Harold's documentation. He claimed ignorance of his father's actions, insisted that current foreclosure procedures followed standard banking practices, and suggested that Harold's evidence might be fabricated by someone with a grudge against financial institutions. Marcus stood, his voice steady as he addressed his former business partner. "Mr. Henderson, 3 weeks ago you personally recommended the Sutton property to my development clients. You assured me that the foreclosure was routine and that Mrs. Sutton had no viable options for saving her home. Given the evidence we've presented tonight, how do you explain that recommendation?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, impossible to ignore and increasingly dangerous with each passing moment. Henderson's response, stammered explanation about coincidental timing, convinced no one and confirmed everything. The town council's emergency session began immediately after the Historical Society presentations concluded. Mayor Patricia Kowalski, a rancher's daughter who'd grown up 3 farms over from the Sutton homestead, called for discussion of immediate actions the town could take to address the crisis. "We have several options," she announced, reading from notes she'd been taking throughout the evening. "We can petition the county to delay the foreclosure pending federal investigation. We can apply for emergency historical designation for the property. We can explore municipal acquisition through eminent domain. Or we can support the Historical Society's proposal to develop the property as a community park." Each option carried risks and complications, but the crowd's energy clearly favored Margaret's park proposal. Harold's pavilion plans had captured imaginations in ways that legal technicalities couldn't match, offering a positive vision for the future rather than just protection from immediate threats. Mabel asked to address the council, her voice carrying across the packed room with the clarity of someone who'd found her purpose. "Harold used to say that the best way to honor the past was to create a future worth leaving to your children. His pavilion plans aren't just about preserving our home, they're about building a place where Pine Creek's children can learn about their heritage while creating new memories." Emma tugged on Logan's sleeve, whispering urgently in his ear. He nodded and helped her approach the microphone that had been set up for public comments. "My dad says sometimes grown-ups make things too complicated," Emma announced, her 8-year-old logic cutting through the evening's elaborate presentations. "Harold's love letters prove that some things are worth keeping forever. His pavilion plans prove that sharing makes things better instead of worse. And the mean bank people prove that some grown-ups forget what's really important, so we should choose love letters and sharing instead of meanness and money." The applause that followed Emma's statement continued for nearly 2 minutes, transforming the community center into something that felt more like a revival meeting than a municipal proceeding. Logan felt tears on his cheeks as he watched his daughter articulate the choice facing their community with perfect clarity. Mayor Kowalski called for a preliminary vote on the Historical Society's park proposal, emphasizing that formal approval would require multiple meetings and extensive legal review. But the unanimous yes from both council members and audience provided the momentum they needed to move forward. As the meeting concluded and residents filed out into the March evening, Logan felt the exhaustion that followed emotional victory. 4 days remained before the foreclosure auction, but tonight had changed the fundamental equation. Pine Creek had chosen preservation over profit, community over individual gain, love letters over legal notices. Henderson slipped out during the final discussions, his departure noticed by everyone and commented on by no one. His absence felt like a confession, acknowledging that some battles couldn't be won through intimidation and financial manipulation. Emma fell asleep in Logan's arms during the drive home, her presentation poster carefully rolled and secured in the truck's cab. In 4 days, they would know whether Harold's 30-year campaign against institutional corruption had finally achieved victory. But tonight, surrounded by neighbors who'd chosen to fight for what mattered, Logan felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death: absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Harold's final carving emerged from its hiding place, like a message from beyond the grave, discovered by Emma in the most unlikely location imaginable. She'd been exploring the root cellar beneath Mabel's farmhouse, while the adults prepared for the foreclosure auction that would determine everything, her flashlight beam catching a glint of something metallic wedged behind the stone foundation. "Dad, Mrs. Mabel, come look at this." Emma's voice echoed up through the cellar stairs, carrying an excitement that made Logan drop the legal documents he'd been reviewing one final time. The metal object turned out to be a small copper box, its surface green with age, but still solid enough to protect whatever Harold had considered worth preserving in the house's most secure location. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had kept moisture at bay for over a year, lay a piece of carved oak that took Logan's breath away. The carving was larger than the firewood-sized pieces they'd discovered earlier, its surface covered with text that flowed across the grain like a river of words. But this wasn't another love letter, it was Harold's final testament, a message he'd intended for exactly this moment. "My dearest Mabel," Logan read aloud, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "If you're reading this, it means the day I've been preparing for has finally arrived. The vultures have come for our land, just as I always knew they would. But don't despair, my love. I've spent 30 years gathering the weapons you'll need to fight them." The carving continued across both sides of the oak piece, Harold's words growing smaller but no less precise as he'd worked to include everything he wanted to say. He'd documented the hiding places where he'd concealed evidence, explained the legal strategies he'd researched, and provided contact information for attorneys and journalists who'd promised to help when the time came. "The pavilion plans aren't just my dream for our land," the carving continued. "They're proof that this property has value beyond what any developer could create. Show people what we could build together, and they'll understand why some things shouldn't be destroyed for profit." Mabel sat on the cellar steps, tears streaming down her cheeks as she heard her husband's voice speaking through carved wood one final time. He knew this day would come. He spent his last years preparing to protect us even after he was gone. Logan photographed the carving with his phone, understanding that Harold's final message would provide the emotional centerpiece for their presentation to the county commissioners. The auction was scheduled for 9 a.m., but Commissioner Martinez had agreed to hear their emergency petition at 8:30 to convince 3 elected officials that justice mattered more than bureaucratic convenience. Emma traced Harold's carved letters with her finger, her face serious with 8-year-old wisdom. "He's still taking care of Mrs. Mabel, even though he's in heaven with the angels." "That's what love does," Mabel said softly. "It keeps working even when the person is gone." They drove to the county courthouse through early morning mist that clung to Pine Creek Valley like a blessing, Logan's truck carrying the 3 generations of Harold's legacy's carved love letters, his community pavilion plans, and his final testimony against the forces that had tried to destroy his family's dreams. Margaret Chen met them in the courthouse parking lot, flanked by a dozen Historical Society members who'd volunteered to support their presentation. The group included faces Logan recognized from the community center, meeting ranchers and retirees, young families and longtime residents, united by shared conviction that some things were worth fighting for. Channel 7 News is here, Margaret reported, nodding toward a van with satellite equipment. Agent Rodriguez from the FBI arrived an hour ago, and Henderson called in sick this morning, first time in 15 years, according to his secretary. Logan felt his pulse quicken with the kind of nervous energy that preceded moments when everything changed. They'd spent 4 weeks building toward this hour, gathering evidence and community support that would either save Mabel's home or prove that institutional power couldn't be challenged by ordinary people with extraordinary determination. Commissioner Martinez, a woman in her 60s who'd grown up on a ranch 40 miles south of Pine Creek, called the emergency session to order with obvious reluctance. County commissioners preferred routine business to constitutional crises, but Harold's evidence had created exactly the kind of situation that demanded immediate attention. "This is highly irregular," Commissioner Martinez announced. "Emergency petitions are typically reserved for natural disasters or genuine public safety threats. However, given the serious allegations that have been brought to our attention, we've agreed to consider your request for a foreclosure delay." Logan stood, carrying Harold's final carving and the weight of responsibility for everything that would follow. Emma sat in the front row beside Mabel, her small hand holding the old woman's weathered fingers in a gesture of support that transcended age and circumstance. "Commissioners," Logan began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd learned to speak truth regardless of consequences. "What we're asking for isn't irregular at all. We're asking you to do what Harold Sutton spent 30 years preparing for: choose justice over convenience, community over corruption, and love over greed." The carved oak piece lay on the petitioner's table like an altar, Harold's final words ready to speak for themselves when legal arguments and emotional appeals had been exhausted. In 15 minutes, they would know whether 3 county commissioners had the courage to stand against institutional power in defense of what mattered most. The future of Pine Creek Valley hung in the balance, waiting for officials who'd never met Harold Sutton to decide whether his legacy would survive the forces that had tried to destroy it. The community petition arrived at the precise moment when legal arguments had reached their limit and emotion needed to carry the day forward. Margaret Chen approached the commissioner's table, carrying 3 loose-leaf binders thick with signatures, each page representing families who'd chosen to stand with Mabel against the institutional forces that had dominated Pine Creek Valley for too long. 743 signatures, Margaret announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades documenting community sentiment. Residents requesting that the county delay foreclosure proceedings pending federal investigation of banking fraud. Taxpayers asking their elected officials to protect historical properties that define their community's character. Commissioner Martinez accepted the binders with obvious surprise. Pine Creek County contained fewer than 8,000 registered voters, making 700 signatures a substantial portion of the electorate. This wasn't just community support, it was a political mandate that couldn't be ignored without consequences. Logan watched the commissioners' faces as they flipped through page after page of names, recognizing the transformation that occurred when bureaucrats realized they were dealing with constituency pressure rather than individual hardship. Political calculations were replacing legal technicalities, exactly the shift they needed to create space for Harold's vision. Emma stood from her seat in the gallery, her small voice carrying clearly through the formal proceedings. "Commissioner Martinez, may I say something about why Harold's love letters matter?" The request violated courtroom protocol, but Commissioner Martinez nodded with the indulgence adults reserved for children who spoke with unexpected wisdom. Please approach the microphone, young lady. Emma walked to the petitioner's podium with the careful dignity of someone who understood the weight of the moment. She carried one of Harold's smaller carved pieces, a heart-shaped section of oak that contained a single sentence. Love is the only thing that grows when you share it. My name is Emma Hale, and I'm 8 years old, she began, her voice steady despite the gravity of addressing 3 officials who held Mabel's future in their hands. I learned about Harold's love letters for my school project, and I want to tell you what they taught me. She held up the carved heart so the commissioners could see Harold's words clearly. Harold carved this for Mrs. Mabel because he knew that some things are too important to write on paper. Paper burns, but love carved in wood lasts forever. That's why the homestead matters. It's not just a house, it's where love lived for 87 years. Commissioner Chen, a man in his 70s who'd grown up on a dairy farm before becoming a retired teacher, leaned forward with obvious interest. What do you think we should do about Mrs. Sutton's home, Emma? I think you should let Harold's pavilion be built, Emma replied without hesitation. He drew pictures of a place where families could come together and kids could learn about how Montana was built by people who loved each other. If you let the mean bank people tear down the homestead, you're saying that money is more important than love stories. The simplicity of Emma's logic cut through the legal complexities that had dominated the morning's proceedings. Commissioner Rodriguez, a former rancher who'd served on the county board for 12 years, asked the question that would determine everything. Mrs. Sutton, if the county delays this foreclosure, what guarantee do we have that you can resolve the tax debt? Mabel stood slowly, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she prepared to address the 3 people who would decide whether Harold's 30-year battle against corruption would end in victory or defeat. She carried Harold's final carving, its weight heavier than oak should be because of the words it contained. Commissioners, she began, her voice gaining strength with each word. I can't guarantee that I'll find $12,000 in the next month. I'm 78 years old, living on Social Security, and I've never been good with money matters. But I can guarantee that if you give us time, Harold's vision will become reality. She placed the carved oak piece on the commissioner's table, its surface catching the fluorescent lights in a way that made Harold's words seem to glow with their own internal fire. My husband spent his last years preparing for this day. He documented every illegal action, preserved every threatening letter, and created plans for a community space that could serve Pine Creek families for generations. All he's asking for, all I'm asking for, is time to let justice work. Commissioner Martinez read Harold's final message aloud, her voice carrying the weight of words that had waited over a year to be heard. The carved testimony detailed not just the Sutton family's harassment, but a pattern of systematic corruption that had affected dozens of families throughout Pine Creek Valley. Harold had been building a case not just for his own property, but for everyone who'd been victimized by institutional greed. This is extraordinary documentation, Commissioner Martinez said, her professional reserve cracking slightly as she processed the implications of Harold's evidence. If these allegations are accurate, we're looking at federal crimes that go back decades. Agent Rodriguez stepped forward from the gallery, her FBI credentials adding federal authority to the proceedings. Commissioners, I can confirm that the Bureau has opened an investigation into First National Bank's foreclosure practices. Mr. Sutton's documentation provides the most comprehensive evidence of banking fraud we've encountered in this district. We're requesting that all related foreclosures be suspended pending completion of our investigation. The room fell silent as the commissioners exchanged glances, each understanding that their decision would reverberate beyond Mabel's individual case. They were choosing between institutional convenience and community justice, between bureaucratic efficiency and moral courage. Commissioner Chen spoke first. Motion to delay foreclosure proceedings for 90 days, pending federal investigation and community input on historical preservation. Commissioner Rodriguez seconded immediately. Motion seconded. This case clearly warrants extraordinary measures. Commissioner Martinez called for the vote that would determine whether Harold's love letters would survive to inspire future generations or disappear into the ash heap of institutional indifference. All in favor of the 90-day delay. 3 hands rose simultaneously, creating the unanimous victory that Harold had been building toward for 30 years. The gallery erupted in applause that continued for nearly 5 minutes, transforming the sterile courtroom into something that felt more like a church celebrating the triumph of faith over cynicism. Emma clapped until her hands hurt, her 8-year-old joy infectious enough to bring tears to eyes that had seen too much disappointment to believe in miraculous reversals. Mabel collapsed into Logan's arms, her composure finally cracking as she realized that Harold's legacy would survive, that their home would remain standing, that love letters carved in wood had proven stronger than institutional power. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by neighbors who'd waited in the March morning cold to hear the verdict, Logan felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time since Sarah's death, he understood that some battles were worth fighting, not because victory was guaranteed, but because the fighting itself transformed everyone involved into something better than they'd been before. Harold Sutton had won his final battle, but more importantly, he'd shown Pine Creek Valley what was possible when people chose courage over convenience, community over corruption, and love over greed. The new community park sign stood where Harold had always envisioned it, carved from the same oak that had sheltered his love letters for 50 years. Sutton Heritage Park proclaimed the weathered wood in letters that Emma had helped design, with smaller text below reading, "Where Love Grows," in Harold's distinctive script. 6 months after the courthouse victory, the transformation of the homestead into Pine Creek's newest gathering place had exceeded even Harold's ambitious dreams. Logan adjusted the final hinge on the park's main gate, his carpenter's satisfaction complete as the handcrafted entrance swung silently on its custom hardware. The gate incorporated several of Harold's original carved pieces, their love letter text now serving as inspiration for visitors who came seeking the peace that only true sanctuaries could provide. "Dad, Mrs. Mabel wants to know if you're ready for the dedication ceremony." Emma called from the pavilion that had risen exactly where Harold's plans had specified. The structure combined his original vision with modern accessibility features, creating a space that honored the past while serving the future. The pavilion's dedication drew nearly 1,000 visitors from across Montana, transforming the September afternoon into the kind of community celebration that Harold had imagined when he first sketched his plans. Families spread blankets on grass that had been pasture 6 months earlier. Children played on playground equipment carved from trees that had grown on Sutton land for decades, and elders shared stories on benches positioned to capture the valley's most magnificent views. Mabel stood at the pavilion's center podium, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd as she prepared to dedicate the park to Harold's memory. She wore the same navy dress she'd chosen for the county commissioners' meeting, but her bearing had transformed from desperate determination to quiet joy. The homestead remained her residence, but it had become something larger, a living testament to the power of love letters carved in wood. Harold always said that the best way to honor the past was to create a future worth leaving to our children. Mabel began, her words echoing across the valley that had witnessed nearly a century of Sutton family history. This park isn't just a memorial to one man's vision, it's proof that communities can choose preservation over profit when they remember what really matters. Logan stood with Marcus near the pavilion's edge, the brothers' relationship transformed by their shared battle against institutional corruption. Marcus had established a pro bono legal clinic, specializing in foreclosure defense, his corporate clients replaced by families fighting to keep their homes. The change hadn't made him wealthy, but it had made him whole in ways that surprised them both. 3 more families this month, Marcus reported quietly, referring to the foreclosure cases that had emerged as federal investigators continued dismantling the network of corruption Harold had documented. Henderson's plea bargain is opening doors we didn't even know existed. Some of these cases go back 20 years. Emma discovered a group of children gathered around the display case that housed Harold's original carved logs, their faces pressed against the glass as they tried to read the love letters that had started everything. A volunteer docent tone of Margaret Chen's Historical Society, colleagues explained how Harold had used hand tools to create messages that would outlast paper and ink. He carved these for his wife because he knew love should last forever, the docent explained, her voice carrying the patient wisdom of someone who'd spent decades sharing important stories with curious young minds. Every tree that grows in this park comes from seeds that were planted on this land, so Harold's love letters are still growing even though he's gone. Agent Rodriguez approached Logan as the dedication ceremony reached its conclusion, her presence a reminder that justice moved slowly but inevitably toward resolution. The FBI investigation had expanded beyond Pine Creek to encompass banking fraud cases across 3 states, with Harold's documentation serving as the foundation for federal prosecutions that would continue for years. "Final sentencing is next month," she reported. "Henderson got 8 years. His development partners got 5 to 12, depending on their level of involvement. Your brother's cooperation was crucial in building the larger case." Logan felt satisfaction rather than vindication. Harold's 30-year campaign against corruption had achieved complete victory, but the real triumph lay in what had grown from the ashes of institutional greed. The park served families every day, the homestead remained Mabel's sanctuary, and Pine Creek had learned that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. As the afternoon celebration wound down, Logan found himself drawn to the family cemetery, where Harold rested beneath the angel he'd carved for himself. The headstone bore a simple inscription: "He loved well and left something beautiful." Visitors had begun leaving flowers and small carved pieces of their own, transforming the burial ground into an ongoing conversation between past and present. Emma approached, carrying a new wooden heart she'd been working on in Harold's restored workshop, her 8-year-old hands growing skillful with the tools that had created so much beauty. "Dad, I made something for Harold," she announced, placing her carving beside his headstone with ceremonial reverence. Logan read his daughter's inscription: "Thank you for teaching us that love letters should last forever." The words were uneven and the carving rough, but the sentiment captured everything Harold had tried to preserve through decades of patient resistance to forces that reduced human stories to profit margins. Mabel joined them as the sun set behind the mountains that had watched over Sutton family dreams for nearly a century. She carried Harold's final carving, the piece that had turned the tide at the county commissioners' meeting now, permanently displayed in the pavilion's place of honor. "He would have loved seeing all those children playing where he used to graze cattle," she said, her voice carrying contentment that had replaced the desperate fear of 6 months earlier. Harold always said the best legacy was laughter in places where love had grown. Logan helped Emma gather her woodworking tools as the park's first day as a public space drew to a close. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new families discovering the pavilion's quiet magic, new children learning that some things were too important to measure in dollars and cents. The carved logs that had started their journey glowed golden in the setting sun, their love letter messages visible through the display case glass to anyone who took time to read them. Harold's words would continue speaking to future generations, reminding them that love carved in wood could survive institutional greed, that community values could triumph over corporate calculation, and that some stories were strong enough to transform despair into hope. Pine Creek Valley had learned to choose preservation over profit, heritage over development, and love over fear. Harold Sutton's legacy lived on in every family that gathered beneath his pavilion, every child who played in gardens that had grown from his dreams, and every visitor who discovered that the most important things in life couldn't be bought or solely shared, preserved, and passed along to those who would come after. The love letters carved in wood had indeed lasted forever, just as Harold had always believed they would.